The evening it started, I was standing in my kitchen making that stupid pasta salad I always make when I don't want to think about dinner. The overhead light was doing its usual thing, throwing everything into that harsh yellow glow that makes everything look cheaper than it is. And I was reaching for the cherry tomatoes when I noticed my shadow on the wall was holding still. Not that I expected it to be perfectly synchronized with my movements. We've all accepted that shadows are a half-second behind reality. Something about the speed of light versus the speed of thought, I think. But this was different. This was frozen. My hand had already gone up toward the cabinet, and my shadow's arm was still hanging at its side, like someone had pressed pause on a movie I was living in. I want you to understand how long I stood there. Long enough for my arm to start aching from holding it up. Long enough for the weirdness to shift from interesting to unsettling in a way that made the hairs on my neck do that thing they do. That electric prickling that tells your lizard brain something is wrong, even when your thinking brain hasn't figured out what yet. I dropped my hand and watched my shadow snap back into place like it had been waiting for permission. And I told myself it was a trick of the light, that the angle of the sun coming through the window was doing something weird, that I was tired and imagining things. But I didn't sleep that night, not really. I kept the lights on and kept looking at the corners of my bedroom, waiting for something that I couldn't name. Something that felt like it was crouching just outside the frame of my vision. I'm Brooke Sullivan, and I moved to Deadwood 3 months ago because my job went remote and I could finally afford to live somewhere that wasn't trying to kill my soul with rent. Deadwood isn't what you'd call bustling, but there's something about the way the hills fold in on each other, dark and secret looking, even in daylight, that made me feel like I'd found a place that understood silence. My apartment is on the second floor of a building that was probably a hotel once, back when this town was famous for something other than tourist traps selling toy guns and overpriced whiskey. The floors are creaky. The radiators clank like they're trying to Morse code messages to each other. And the walls are thin enough that I know when my neighbor Gerald is watching his shows at 2 a.m. It's not glamorous, but it's quiet. And quiet was what I needed after years of apartment living, where my thin walls became a constant education in other people's lives. I don't believe in ghosts. I want to be clear about that. I'm the kind of person who needs things explained, who gets uncomfortable when people start talking about energy and vibes, because those words have been emptied out by people who don't want to do the hard work of actually understanding things. But that night, lying in bed with the lights on, I found myself wishing I did believe in something, because the alternative was believing that my mind had suddenly started lying to me. And that felt worse. That felt like the kind of thing that couldn't be fixed with an explanation. 3 days passed where I didn't really think about it. I went to work, I made my coffee, I texted my sister in Phoenix about our mother's latest bout of difficult behavior, and I almost managed to convince myself that I'd imagined the whole thing, or been too tired to see clearly. Then, on Thursday evening, I was sitting on my couch watching that documentary about the Alaska disappearances, because I have terrible taste in entertainment when I'm alone, and I shifted position to grab my phone from the cushion beside me. My legs folded under me, and as I leaned to the left, the streetlight outside my window threw my shadow long across the wall behind the TV. I went left, and my shadow went right. Not dramatically, not like it was mocking me or trying to be clever, but just that simple wrongness, that fundamental inversion that shouldn't have been possible. I sat there for a full minute without moving, my phone forgotten in my hand, and I watched it. The shadow didn't move with me. It stayed exactly where it was, stretched across the wall in that same diagonal, while I sat upright and still and watched it not follow the laws of physics that I'd accepted as unbreakable since I was old enough to understand that light and matter didn't always get along. I finally moved on purpose, slowly, like I was testing a wound to see how deep it went. And I watched my shadow lag behind me by a full second before snapping back to where it should have been all along. The next day, I started keeping a notebook. I'm not a journal person, never have been, but something about having to write it down made the experience feel real instead of like one of those half-remembered dreams that dissolves the moment you try to grab it. I logged the time, the location in my apartment, what I was doing, and what my shadow did, and I started to see a pattern emerge that made my stomach feel like it was trying to crawl up into my throat and hide there. The wrongness happened most often when I was moving slowly, when my actions were small and almost unconscious. Reaching for things, turning my head, adjusting my weight. Big, dramatic movements seemed to sink fine, but the little movements, the ones we make without thinking, the ones that are almost muscle memory, those were the ones my shadow chose to ignore. I felt stupid writing it down, like I was a kid documenting a game of pretend, but I kept writing anyway because I needed to know if I was losing my mind or if something was actually happening to me. On Saturday morning, I woke up early and stood in front of my bathroom mirror, watching my reflection and its shadow at the same time, trying to see if the effect was different when it was a reflected shadow instead of a direct one. The reflection looked fine. The reflection moved when I moved, like a proper reflection should. But when I turned my back to the mirror and watched the wall behind me, my shadow stood still while I raised my hand. And I saw my reflection raise its hand too. And I understood that there were two versions of me that night. One that was following the rules and one that wasn't. That's when I started sleeping with the bathroom light on and a knife under my pillow. And that's when the nightmares started. I don't tell people things easily. My sister says I've been like this since I was a kid, that I learned early to keep things close to my chest because asking for help meant admitting something was wrong. And admitting something was wrong meant other people got to look at you like you were broken. So I didn't call anyone. I didn't tell my landlord or my co-workers or the nice lady at the coffee shop who always remembers my order. Instead, I did what I always do when something doesn't make sense. I researched. I spent every evening that week on my laptop, looking up everything I could find about shadows and light and perception and all the ways that physics could theoretically bend without breaking. I learned about umbras and penumbras and the way shadows change size based on the angle of the light source. I learned that there's a condition called Charles Bonnet syndrome, where people with vision loss see things that aren't there. I learned that there are places in the world where the magnetic poles are shifting and compasses don't point where they should, where pilots have to recalculate everything they thought they knew about navigation. None of it helped. None of it explained why my shadow moved on a delay when I moved slowly, or why it sometimes didn't move at all, or why the wrongness got worse at night when I was tired and alone, and the apartment felt like it was holding its breath around me. I started testing things systematically because that's the kind of person I am. I turned off all the lights except one and moved around my living room like a performer in a one-woman show, trying to map out exactly when and where the discrepancy happened. It was worse near walls. It was worse when I was tired. It was worse when I felt like I was being watched, which was always now, which was the new background radiation of my existence. That feeling that something was standing just behind my left shoulder, something patient and quiet that didn't need to rush because it had all the time in the world. I called in sick to work on Friday and spent the whole day in my apartment, moving from room to room. testing the walls and the windows and the light fixtures. And I found something that made my hand shake so badly I could barely hold my phone. When I stood in the hallway outside my bedroom, in the one spot where the overhead light didn't quite reach, my shadow didn't just lag behind. It turned. It turned and faced me while I stood still, while I faced the wall with my arms at my sides, and I watched its head rotate until it was looking at me directly. And I could feel it looking at me even though it didn't have eyes, even though it was just darkness shaped like a person. That horrible inverted person that had been following me around my whole life without ever doing anything more interesting than moving a little too slow. I turned around. I turned around and faced my shadow. And we stood there in that dark hallway, like two people who'd had too much to drink and were trying to figure out whether to fight or dance. And I understood then that I wasn't the one being haunted. I was the one haunting something. Something had been living in the margins of my existence, in the spaces where light couldn't reach. And now that I was paying attention, now that I was awake to its presence, it was paying attention back. The dream started a week after the hallway. I don't remember all of them because that's the nature of dreams. They slip through your fingers like water, but I remember the feeling of them, that thick, sticky feeling of being watched and evaluated, like I was being graded on something I didn't know I'd been tested on. In one dream, I was standing in my living room, and there were shadows everywhere, in all the wrong places, stretched across walls where no light was shining, crouched in corners where the light was too bright. They weren't moving. They were still, all of them, like they'd been placed there deliberately, like someone was arranging furniture in a room I didn't know had been built. I woke up from that dream with a nosebleed and a feeling of wrongness that didn't go away even after I'd washed my face and changed my shirt and stood in my kitchen drinking coffee at 3 a.m, like some kind of sad lighthouse. The nosebleeds happened 3 more times that week. Each time, I felt more tired when I woke up, like something had been using my sleeping hours to do something I wasn't aware of, something that took energy that should have been mine. I started finding things moved in the morning, not dramatically, not like in horror movies where doors are suddenly open and furniture is overturned. Small things, a glass of water on my nightstand that I didn't remember putting there, a chair pushed in when I always leave it at an angle. My bathroom mirror had handprints on it one morning, handprints that shouldn't have been there because I never touched the mirror after I showered. And I stood there staring at those prints while my reflection stared back at me with the right shadow, the one that moved when I moved. And I wanted to scream because my reflection was the only thing in my apartment that still made sense. I called my sister because I didn't know what else to do. I told her I wasn't sleeping well, which was true. I told her I was stressed about work, which was partially true. I didn't tell her about the shadows because I knew how it would sound, and I wasn't ready to hear her suggest that I talk to someone, that I get some help, that I might be experiencing what people who believe in mental wellness sometimes suggest when someone's reality starts to crack around the edges. But talking to her helped anyway. Just hearing her voice and her stories about her kids and her job and her life that was still happening in a world where shadows followed their owners like loyal dogs. After we hung up, I sat in my living room in the dark because I'd started preferring the dark now. Started feeling like the shadows were less wrong when there was less light to be wrong in. And I thought about how strange it was that I'd moved here to find quiet, and what I'd found instead was something that had been waiting for me, something patient and old and very, very interested in the fact that I could see it now when I couldn't see it before. I started thinking about the word projection and how it means both the light-based image and the psychological act of imposing your feelings onto others, and I wondered if I'd been doing both all along. Projecting something out into the world and then watching it come back to me shaped like a question I didn't know how to answer. That's when I heard it. A sound from inside my apartment, somewhere in the walls, like footsteps, but too slow, too deliberate, like something was walking through the spaces between the studs, through the dark that existed inside my walls, even when all the lights were on. The footsteps in the walls got worse. I started hearing them at night, during the day, all the time, like something was walking the perimeter of my life and taking notes. I talked to my landlord about it, and he sent someone to check the pipes and the vents and the floors, and the person said everything was fine. That old buildings just make noise, and I wanted to grab him by his tool belt and scream that this wasn't normal noise. This was the sound of something that wasn't supposed to be there, learning how to be there. But I just nodded and thanked him, and closed the door and stood in my empty apartment, listening to the footsteps walk past the place where I was standing. I started leaving my lights on all the time, because when I left them on, the wrongness was less wrong, the shadows were closer to where they should be, and I didn't want to admit why that was. Didn't want to admit that I'd figured out the pattern, even though my notebook was full of evidence that pointed to one terrifying conclusion. The wrongness happened when I was tired. The wrongness happened when I was alone. The wrongness happened when I was moving slowly and almost invisibly. Those small movements that nobody notices. Those small movements that add up to a life. Something was learning me. Something that lived in the places where light didn't touch was learning the shape of my existence by watching me live it. And the more I noticed it, the more real it became. And the more real it became, the more it wanted. I stopped going out. I stopped answering messages. I sat in my apartment with all the lights on and watched my walls, and waited for something that I was starting to understand might be inevitable. The shadows were always wrong now, always a second or two behind, always facing the wrong direction, or stretched across walls where no light was shining, and I could feel it. That thing in the darkness, that presence that had been watching me since the night I reached for cherry tomatoes and found that I wasn't alone in my own movement. Last night, I did something I'm not proud of. I turned off all the lights and stood in my living room in the dark, in the complete dark, and I waited. I waited until my eyes adjusted and the shapes of my furniture started to emerge from the blackness. And then I stood very still, and I moved only my left hand, very slowly, the way you move when you're trying not to wake someone sleeping next to you. And I watched the place where my shadow should have been appearing on the wall in front of me. It appeared, but it wasn't my shadow. It was taller than me, broader than me, and it was facing me while I faced the wall, and it was raising its hand too, in perfect synchronization with my slow, small movement, and I understood then what had been happening all along. I was the shadow. Somewhere in the dark parts of my perception, in the places where I wasn't quite awake to my own existence, something else was living the life I'd been living, moving through the world while I thought I was moving through it. And now that I could see it, now that the light had gotten low enough to show me the truth, I could see that I had never been alone in my own body. I had never been alone in my own shadow. Something had been wearing my darkness like a costume, and I had only just noticed because I had finally started paying attention to the shape of my own existence. I stood there in the dark with that thing that was me and not me, and I felt something that might have been terror or might have been relief, and I didn't move, didn't turn around, because I wasn't sure anymore which one of us was the original and which one was the copy, and I'm still standing here. I'm still standing here in the dark, trying to figure out how to move forward when I'm not sure anymore which direction is mine. The shadows in your apartment aren't matching your movements. When you notice this, when you really notice it for the first time, pay attention to what happens next, because something is always watching, something is always learning. And if you can see it, that means it's been there all along, wearing your darkness like a second skin, waiting for you to finally look.